This remarkable aircraft was much more than a superb fighter. It was a symbol of hope to a nation in grave danger. The Supermarine Spitfire embodied the spirit and spunk of the British nation during the Second World War. After Nazi Germany's army had rapidly moved across Europe, destroying everything in its path, the Spitfire kept the German Luftwaffe from controlling the skies over England and causing wholesale panic. The Spitfire was not the only fighter the British had at their command. It was not even the best fighter in all categories, but it was the most famous fighter, the aircraft that the entire British Empire looked to for moral support and excellence in battle. And it did not disappoint. Engaged in every major action, the Spitfire flew on every front from 1939 until the war ended. Built in greater numbers than any other British aircraft, the Spitfire underwent a number of successful design changes to improve performance. Each new model flew faster, higher, and longer than the last. Above the battlefields of England, no aircraft ever flew with more grace and determination than the Supermarine Spitfire. The Spitfire began life in the early 30s, when its predecessors from Supermarine won the Schneider Cup Trophy, an international speed and endurance competition. These seaplanes were some of the first single-wing designs. Their streamlined frame and single wing were able to cut down on air drag. This, in turn, increased their speed up to 350 miles an hour, more than 100 miles faster than the older biplane designs. Across Europe, nations watched each other's developments in military aviation with great interest. As the decade of the 30s progressed, the Nazi Party came to power in Germany. Their nationalist policies resulted in a steady buildup of their military might. British Air Ministry leaders became aware of Germany's new air power during the Spanish Civil War. In 1936, Stuka dive bombers and Messerschmitt 109s sent to aid the dictator Franco helped to bring the democratic forces to their knees. Though Britain was building many of the new Hawker Hurricane fighters, their Air Ministry leaders knew they needed a plane that could fly faster, farther, and with more firepower than Germany's Messerschmitt 109. The Hurricane was not up to the task. It was then that Supermarine was given the go-ahead to build the Spitfire, the plane that would help save a nation. The Spitfire underwent a number of changes during its development. The Supermarine design team continually sought to increase efficiency and performance. The Spitfire 1 had a wingspan of 36 feet 10 inches, with a length of just over 29 feet and a height of 11 feet 5 inches. Powered by one Rolls-Royce Merlin II 12-cylinder liquid-cooled engine, the Spitfire had a maximum speed of 362 miles an hour. It could climb 2,500 feet a minute and had a service ceiling of about 20,000 feet. Future models would be able to climb above 37,000 feet. Standard armaments included 8 Browning machine guns with 300 rounds of ammunition. With each new Spitfire model, designers worked to increase range, firepower, and maneuverability.
The Spitfire, for example, a remarkable airplane in the sense that designed just about the time as the Messerschmitt 109, and roughly equal, probably if you compared the two airplanes, one would have an advantage in one flight regime, another in another flight regime. I often think of it this way, probably, certainly in the Battle of Britain, the German probably, in the way of the 109, had a more effective, aggressive hunt and seek fighter, and hunter-killer fighter, while the Spitfire, the much more effective airplane as an air defense fighter, a maneuverable fighter, both of them at that point fairly short range. The interesting thing about the Spitfire that you don't find, I think, with the 109 is the Spitfire much more adaptable in the long term to modification. And extraordinarily effective versions of the Spitfire were flying all the way through the war, and as I recall, even after the war. The Spitfire development went through Mark 19 or Mark 21 with very sophisticated engines and props and heavy armament. So if there's a net difference, the Spitfire is the much more modern and sustainable airplane because of its ability to adapt to increased modification.
By the end of the Battle of Britain, the Spitfire was coming on a line in quite some larger quantities. The Hurricane remained in use by the British throughout the war, but it was mostly a defensive aircraft, an interceptor, and both it and the Spitfire were relatively short-range airplanes because their mission was to scramble, climb to altitude in a hurry, and engage any enemy aircraft, shoot down bombers or whatever over England. They did take them over to the main the continent when the what they called the phony war was going on in late 1939 and 1940. But I got to fly both the Spitfire and the Hurricane. They're very nice to fly. Nice, smooth flying airplanes, and as I say, good performance, but they didn't have any range, so they couldn't be utilized for escorting bombers. And I think that's one reason the British had to revert to nighttime bombing, because they didn't have any fighter cover.
At the start of the war against Germany on September 3rd, 1939, the Spitfire was just beginning to make its appearance. For the rest of 1939 and early 1940, only a few squadrons were equipped with a Spitfire and based in France. This was the period called the Phony War, when many air battles occurred, but they were sporadic and did not involve many planes. This all changed with Germany's invasion of France. The speed of Germany's victory in France was of great concern to the British. French leaders begged British Prime Minister Winston Churchill to send more and more planes. Churchill felt like he had to comply to help keep the French in the war. He sent as many Spitfires as he dared, going against the pleas from his own Air Force not to deplete the relatively small numbers they had at their disposal. Royal Air Force leaders were adamant about retaining most of their planes at home to protect the British Isle. While many Spitfires and their pilots showed courage and skill during the evacuation of the British Army at Dunkirk, the RAF was roundly criticized for not throwing more planes into battle. The retreating soldiers, both on the beaches and in thousands of boats, had to brave death at the hands of German bombers, fighters, and artillery based only a few miles away. Though the RAF's reputation was sullied, they would, before the war was over, again earn the respect and admiration of their countrymen and an entire world when they turned back the German tide during the Battle of Britain. By the end of the summer of 1940, the shadow of the conquering German armies covered Western Europe. In a very short time, German tanks and artillery had conquered France and moved into position along the coast. Now, Adolf Hitler stood, just as Napoleon had more than 100 years before, and looked across the English Channel to the one fighting obstacle that stood between him and European domination. The chalky cliffs of Britain rose sheer and white out of the choppy waters. And beyond, Great Britain, smaller in size than the state of Wyoming. The fall of Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Denmark, Norway, Holland, Belgium, France had given Hitler great resources to call upon for his next endeavor. For he now turned his attention to England. The war on the continent was all but over. It was time for the final push in Europe, which would become known as the Battle of Britain.
When Germany began the war in September of 1939, their use of air power, ground-oriented though it was highly effective. The Luftwaffe was structured and trained, organized, and well-equipped to be used in a ground support role against Poland first, and then subsequently against France. Those wars were very quick and very successful for the Germans. They astonished the world with their ferocity, intensity, and effectiveness, not to mention their speed. But when the German Air Force came up against Great Britain, for example, in the Battle of Britain, what we might characterize as the first truly strategic air war, we found that the Germans weren't quite so well equipped to conduct that. In other words, they didn't have the long-range airplanes with sufficient bomb loads. Their crews weren't sufficiently trained to hit targets some distance from their bases in France across the Channel. German leadership was wholly inadequate. German intelligence didn't yield the kind of target arrays that would have been necessary to defeat Britain, and despite a certain amount of mythology about how close the Battle of Britain was, recent historiography would seem to indicate that the German Luftwaffe from the beginning just wasn't quite up to the task. That doesn't denigrate the achievement of the Royal Air Force or Fighter Command and the bravery shown by both sides, but the German tactically oriented Air Force, which had been so good supporting the Wehrmacht in France and in Poland, wasn't quite up to the task of subduing Great Britain by itself, nor even adequately preparing for any projected invasion of the British Isles.
Hitler and his generals drafted their plans for the battle. Every detail was thought to be anticipated. 6 weeks of final preparation went into those plans. 6 weeks to determine the future of Europe. German plan for invasion of England. Phase 1. Destroy the Royal Air Force and its bases. Gain control of the air and the sea lanes across the Channel. Follow the Blitz plan that had wiped out Poland, the Low Countries, and France. Destroy communication and transport lines. Gain air superiority. Phase 2. Pulverize the coastline with dive bombers. Drop parachute troops to take over the airfields and establish beachheads. Phase 3. Actual invasion. Pour the German panzer divisions across on high-speed barges under an umbrella of protecting fighter planes. Then send spearheads of armed divisions to divide, surround, and destroy the British Home Guard. Along the Channel invasion coast, more than 100 fully equipped German divisions were singing the Nazi theme song, "We are sailing against England," as they waited the word from Hitler. Here, for weeks, all the supplies and weapons of the Nazi war machine had been turned toward Britain. Britain also had an army, but it was an army that had just suffered a bitter defeat at Dunkirk. It was an army without weapons. These had been left behind on the roads of France. Tanks, guns, motorized equipment, all abandoned to save men. In all of Britain, there was not enough equipment for one modern division. Only one tank for every 1,000 square miles of territory. Only one machine gun for every 1,500 yards of beach. Britain's navy was scattered all over the globe, guarding food and supply lines. And the British knew it would be suicide to use their fleet in the narrow waters of the English Channel, with the German Air Force in control of the air. Britain also had a Royal Air Force, an Air Force outnumbered 10 to 1 by the Germans, both in men and machines. it came. August 8, 1940, the battle for Britain was on. The Luftwaffe. In dozens of flights, hundreds of planes, bombers, fighters, dive bombers, across the 21 miles of channel in 8 short minutes. Their first tactics were to bomb convoys in the channel, convoys loaded with food and munitions bound for the great port of London. German fighters waited overhead for the Spitfires of the Royal Air Force to appear. They didn't have long to wait. The RAF came facing odds of 10 to 1. Then the Luftwaffe battled the great port towns of Southampton and Plymouth, trying to stop the flow of supplies from overseas. But the cargo went on being unloaded with the protection of the RAF overhead. Battling the Spitfires and Hurricanes in the air wasn't working, so German Air Marshal Göring switched his main attacks to the fighter airfields at Dover, Deal, and Bucking. The Luftwaffe tried to destroy the RAF planes on the ground. But Britain, unlike Poland and the Low Countries, didn't make the mistake of bunching its planes on the runways. The planes of the RAF were scattered and hidden, only a few on any one field, and those in the far corners. After the bombing, the Spitfires still went up to meet the enemy.
Take cover.
Spitfire. The Nazi plan was not working out. On a 2,000-mile front from Norway to France, the whole Nazi Blitz program was being stalled because the RAF was still in the air. Between August 24 and September 5, 35 major attacks were launched. They cost the Germans 562 planes, while the British lost only 219 planes. Invasion now would have to wait. The Nazis would avoid the RAF and smash the great city of London into the rubble heap they had made of Warsaw and Rotterdam. The first blow came on September 7th, when 375 German planes came roaring up the Thames River. The Battle of Britain became the Battle of London. The Germans broke through the Spitfires that went out to meet them. Gone was any pretense of aiming at military objectives. This attack was directed at the British people. For 28 days, the Nazis dropped everything they had on London. Tons upon tons of high explosives, delayed action bombs that exploded days later, torpedoes that shoot away whole buildings. And underneath the war in the air, the work went on. Against all that Nazi Germany could muster, Britain was refusing to crumble up. Across the Channel, the enraged Göring took personal command of the operation, and on September 15th, he sent the Luftwaffe into one of its greatest attacks. 500 German bombers and Messerschmitt fighters roared over the English coast. The British met the challenge by throwing in everything they had. Leading the way was the Supermarine Spitfire. An historic three-dimensional battle took place inside an area 60 miles long, 38 broad, and from 5 to 6 miles high. Individual dogfights took place within the first 30 minutes of the raid. Some of the German bombers broke through London's defenses and reached the center of the city. Of the 500 German airplanes that came over that day, more than one-third were shot down. In the 28 days of terror from September 7th to October 5th, the Nazis dropped 50 million pounds of bombs on the city, killing 7,000 civilians and wounding 10,000 more. But in these 28 days, the Nazis lost hundreds of planes and their crews. The more they sent over, the more were shot down. The British Spitfire had proved to be one of the deadliest weapons of the war.
Ground-oriented though it was highly effective. The Luftwaffe was structured and trained, organized, and well-equipped to be used in a ground support role against Poland first, and then subsequently against France. Those wars were very quick and very successful for the Germans. They astonished the world with their ferocity, intensity, and effectiveness, not to mention their speed. But when the German Air Force came up against Great Britain, for example, in the Battle of Britain, what we might characterize as the first truly strategic air war, we found that the Germans weren't quite so well equipped to conduct that. In other words, they didn't have the long-range airplanes with sufficient bomb loads. Their crews weren't sufficiently trained to hit targets some distance from their bases in France across the Channel. German leadership was wholly inadequate. German intelligence didn't yield the kind of target arrays that would have been necessary to defeat Britain, and despite a certain amount of mythology about how close the Battle of Britain was, recent historiography would seem to indicate that the German Luftwaffe from the beginning just wasn't quite up to the task. It doesn't denigrate the achievement of the Royal Air Force or Fighter Command and the bravery shown by both sides, but the German tactically oriented Air Force, which had been so good supporting the Wehrmacht in France and in Poland, wasn't quite up to the task of subduing Great Britain by itself, nor even adequately preparing for any projected invasion of the British Isles.
For a solid year, the Nazis struck Britain with all their might. They leveled thousands upon thousands of homes and damaged millions of others. They killed more than 40,000 men, women, and children, and seriously wounded 50,000 more. But not one single Nazi soldier set foot on British soil. The British did more than save their country. They won for the world a year of precious time. It was not only for the Spitfire pilots that Winston Churchill spoke when he said, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." The Spitfire also played a large role in rolling back Rommel in the deserts of North Africa. To supply the Allies with the planes was not an easy task, however. They had to be shipped out of England and assembled in a safe, remote place. It was accomplished by using the British protectorate at Gibraltar, at the northwestern tip of the Mediterranean. Because of its location and impregnability, Gibraltar became one of the most important centers for Allied supply routes to the Middle East and North African campaigns. Out of the hulls of ships just arrived from Britain, large crates were unloaded onto trailers below. Inside, packed tight, were component parts of the latest type of Spitfire. Tractor and trailer lost no time and soon were speeding on their way to the compound where other aircraft are in various stages of construction. A check is made as they are ready for unloading. First, the fuselage is pulled out and put on a trestle by the Spitfire erection party, the unit responsible for the whole job. While the fuselage is being fixed, other men unload the wings, and still more are at work on the propeller. From here, the machine was moved into another compound, where all pipes and wires are joined, and the armament installed. After which, ammunition was brought, and the cannons are tested. To the ground troops. The Spitfire was again asked to lead the way. The Royal Air Force squadrons based in France after the Normandy invasion were composed entirely of fighters. Their role was twofold: to harass the enemy and to protect their own troops from air attack. The job of air protection fell mainly on the Spitfire. The beachhead at Normandy, though secure, was very limited in depth, only 4 miles in some places, 12 or 15 miles in others. Within this space was a great army with tens of thousands of trucks and hundreds of thousands of tons of ammunition and supplies. Soldiers crowded the roads and byways. There was hardly a field or orchard that didn't serve as a camping ground or supply depot. Concealment was impossible. Above it all, the swirling columns of dust. Behind this army lay the beaches, with thousands of craft flying back and forth, and the freighters lying out in the deeper water. 2 or 3 squadrons of German fighter bombers could have caused great damage. The Spitfires didn't allow this to happen. The Spitfires also had the task of harassing the Germans in the battle zone. The first essentials were to deny to the Germans the freedom of movement they had enjoyed. Already, thanks to the air attack, the Germans were being forced to biplane some of their reinforcements at sites up to 250 miles away. In a few days, enemy movement ceased by day. Only at night could a few Nazi planes venture out, thanks to the continual bombing by the Allies. To obtain the closest liaison between Allied armor and the air, a specially converted tank carrying signal equipment and an RAF officer advanced with the columns. When the troops were in need of assistance, the tanks called up the Spitfires waiting overhead and directed them down by visual observation onto their targets. In this way, German tanks and 88mm guns were often knocked out within a few minutes of making their presence known. Records of German telephone conversations found later were eloquent testimony to the effect of the air assaults. Again and again, the high command ordered, "Attack! Attack!" The answer came back, "We cannot. We are pinned down from the air."
Later on in the war, of course, the attrition rate kept going, and they didn't have a large pool of men available to train as pilots. It got to where they were taking youngsters just out of high school, I guess, and some of ours weren't much older either. But they would teach them to fly, and they'd give them just a very little bit of training in a fighter-type aircraft like the Messerschmitt or the Focke-Wulf 190, and set them up to fight. And there were occasions, in fact, one of my other flights in my squadron there came across some two enemy fighters at one time on a mission. They maneuvered to get on their tail, and they just pulled off the canopy and bailed out of the airplane without a shot being fired. And there were other reports of this type of thing happening too. So toward the end of the war, they had a few. Galland was one of them who survived, but most of their well-trained people were eventually casualties of the war.
Despite great successes, it was impossible to prevent the Germans from concentrating part of their forces and equipment on the invasion. They placed these with great skill in a series of highly fortified belts. To attempt a frontal assault would be costly in lives and equipment. It was decided to call in the help of the heavy bombers. At Caen, at Como, and twice during their advance to Valais, the bombers flew in tactical support. Due to the lack of enemy fighters, the individual tactics of the night heavy bombers could now be employed by day. In fact, they offered a less attractive target to the enemy than smaller bombers flying in close formation. The RAF's black bombers swarmed the German positions. A great victory. The Third Reich was now history. History, truly a global war. 57 nations fought each other across oceans, over mountains, and throughout Europe and Africa. For America, it began and ended as an air war. But between the attack on Pearl Harbor and the dropping of the atomic bomb on Nagasaki, many would die in the air, on land, and sea. This is the story of the Warbirds of World War II. 7 airplanes from different countries that made a tremendous impact in the greatest air war in history. None of them was perfect. Each had shortcomings either in design or performance. But with the right pilot in the cockpit, each Warbird could and did excel in flight, becoming by the end of the war the stuff of legend. Each of the major powers developed new aircraft to meet the huge demands of World War II. The United States alone produced 100,000 airplanes in 1944. England, Germany, and Japan all created new models of fighters and bombers in an effort to gain air supremacy. Between the Axis and the Allied powers, air power would be the dominant factor in establishing control over enemy territory. To achieve air supremacy in this great and horrific world war would require the greatest warbirds in history. This is their story. Many laughed when Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party first came to power in Germany. But with a highly effective mobile army, the Wehrmacht, and a well-equipped air force, the Luftwaffe, Germany posed a great threat to all of Europe. On March 11, 1938, German mechanized forces, escorted by 400 aircraft, crossed the Austrian border. Hitler himself followed the next day and quickly swallowed up the Republic of Austria. On September 30, 1938, the Munich Agreement was signed. Without firing a shot or dropping a bomb, Hitler's military machine had won a great victory. The next day, 500 German aircraft, led by a sleek, experienced fighter, took part in the invasion of the Sudetenland. Then, British appeasement left Hitler free to conquer Czechoslovakia. At dawn on September 1, 1939, Hitler directed the Luftwaffe in a lightning-quick campaign against Poland. Without warning, 2,000 modern German combat planes took off for the first aerial blitzkrieg in history. With this dramatic salute to air power, World War II began. And leading the way was a fighter aircraft that was already a legend. It had raced across the map of Europe, striking at Spain during its Civil War. It helped to crush Poland, and then Norway, then south toward Holland and Belgium, and on to France. This fighter seemed invincible, its pilots daring and dashing. For many, it epitomized the German spirit. It was known as the Messerschmitt 109. The Messerschmitt Me-109 was first flown in 1935. Its sleek design shocked military planners worldwide who were used to the open cockpit biplanes of World War I. Created by German professor Willy Messerschmitt, the Me-109 was designed to achieve top performance levels by having a compact, highly efficient airframe that could hold the most powerful engines in Germany. The Messerschmitt 109 was a fast and agile single-seat fighter, dubbed Emil by the pilots that flew her. It was the mainstay of Germany's fighter air force. Powered by a 1,175 horsepower Daimler-Benz DB piston engine, it had a maximum speed of 348 miles an hour and could climb to over 3,200 feet in just over a minute. The 109 had a maximum takeoff weight of 5,875 pounds. Empty, it weighed just over 4,000 pounds. It had a span of 32 feet 4 inches and a length of 28 feet 4 inches. Its main armaments were two 20-millimeter cannon and two 7.92-millimeter machine guns.
I think aviation historians and people who knew the airplane would suggest it was one of the greatest aircraft of the war. It clearly resulted from pre-war development in the 1930s, had the capability to be continually modified and used throughout the war in a number of roles. and was highly effective. I think, as I recall, it was the German aircraft that saw the largest production. Something like 36,000 of these airplanes were built, used on all fronts and all theaters, even used by German allies. Highly capable, certainly at the beginning of the war, probably the single best fighter aircraft, attack fighter aircraft in the war. Heavily armed. Tendency was to upgun it, that is, to increase its firepower, to modify the engine to increase horsepower. I think it's fair to say, however, the airframe probably reached its apex somewhere around 42, 43, and after that, subsequent modifications, while increasing power and altitude and range and all of that stuff, came at the detriment of pure performance in terms of turning capability and these sorts of things. And the Germans might have been better served by emphasizing the production of other airplanes like the FW190, certainly subsequently the Me-262, the jet aircraft. But there were so many constraints on German industry in terms of resources and in their leadership, not far-sighted. They had such a convoluted way of doing things that this airplane remained in production, arguably when it wasn't quite so effective anymore. I mean, clearly it was still in use right at the very end of the war, and it had its advocates, but it had been overtaken, I think, in many ways by any number of Allied aircraft at that point.
109 had been developed before the war, you know, and they had made improvements on it. It was a very good performing aircraft, high altitude and pretty good speed. Our aircraft could exceed its speed, but, you know, you don't use high speed very often except maybe in a dive. Most of the combat involves making turns, you know, and try to outturn the other fellow. You get your gun sight on him so you can shoot him down. And I think we could turn a little better than the 109. We could fight on even terms with him and all the way across to Poland.
After the French surrender, only the British Royal Air Force remained for the Luftwaffe to conquer. As German aircraft crossed the Channel, led by the Me-109, a modest but well-trained force of British airmen equipped with Spitfires and Hurricanes fought back. For weeks, great air battles took place across the Channel and over the skies of England. Me-109s fought well against Allied bombers and fighters, but in the end, it was not well enough. Protecting their homeland, often outnumbered, the Spitfires and Hurricanes shot down more German aircraft than the Luftwaffe could afford. Hitler was forced to switch to night raids, but the Luftwaffe's final effort was desperate and doomed to failure. Britain's airmen fought furiously, and England was saved. In retrospect, it appeared that the Luftwaffe had much more success in support of land operations rather than as a strategic air force.
Germany built up an air force almost from scratch in the 1930s. They did this in some sense clandestinely. The aircraft technology was sophisticated and probably would be considered first-rate. The leadership tended to be not so first-rate, at least at the senior levels. The young pilots were easily the match of any pilots anywhere in the world. They were enthusiastic. They had a high degree of training. Many of them had practiced aerial combat skills in places like Spain in the 1930s. The creation of the Luftwaffe brought with a selection of some of the very best of the young German Army officers. At the senior level, however, some of these folks were transplants from the Army, and Germany, a continental traditional land power, they brought with them an Army focus and created an Air Force, once again, that was, in terms of its thinking, dominated by the support the Army, ground attack, quick, short war. Germany, constrained by resources, recognizably, didn't have the production capability, certainly didn't have the oil production capability to sustain a long war, so this seemed like a logical thing to do. Some of the more famous German long-range strategic air power advocates, one in particular, Walter Weber, was killed before he could have a huge impact on the organization and structure and even the technology of the newly formed German Luftwaffe. And at the very top, Hermann Goering, while gifted in some ways in terms of building up this Air Force, and certainly had Hitler's ear as a personal friend and a Nazi confidant, lacked what anybody would consider true strategic vision. And while the early part of the war went very well for the Germans, starting with the Battle of Britain, when these difficulties, when these shortfalls became so apparent, Goering increasingly withdrew and was extraordinarily ineffective as a leader. So much so, it's surprising that the Luftwaffe did as well as it did.
The defeat of the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain, and then the subsequent heavy demands placed upon the German air service, caused a reduction in the overall quality of the fighters in the air and of the pilots who flew them.
Well, early on they were good, and they were experienced. They knew what they were doing, and they were good flyers and did well. As the war moved forward and they were able to fly less and less, that they got additional pilots, or the new pilots came in. They were not, let me say it this way, their capability or their ability to fly and maneuver decreased. They were not as experienced or not as good a pilots. They didn't perform as well toward the end of the war as they did earlier in the war. Early in the war, they were good.
As the war wore on, new Allied fighters such as the P-51 came onto the scene. The Me-109 and the P-51 Mustang made for dramatic air-to-air combat. The Mustang, coming late in the war, was used primarily as an escort fighter. Bombers would leave their bases in England an hour ahead of the Mustangs. Then, somewhere over the Dutch or German border, the faster Mustangs would catch up with the bombers and relieve the P-38s and P-47s. As they moved deeper into Germany, the group of escorting Mustangs would watch every corner of the sky, weaving ahead, above, below, all around the bombers, like a screen of destroyers protecting the main fleet. They never had to wait long for a rendezvous with the Me-109. Just prior to an attack, the P-51 pilots would get rid of their long-range wing tanks to give them greater mobility. The 109s massed for an attack on the bombers, while the P-51 pilots watch and wait. The Germans' Me-109s attacked the Allied bombers from behind. Gun camera film captured from this Me-109 shows how they hammered the bombers with their 22mm cannons. Day after day, month after month, the Mustangs fought the Messerschmitts. While Allied bomber and fighter losses were less than the Germans, they were still high. More bombers and fighters and more well-trained pilots were sent each day, and the Allied fleets grew ever larger. While the Axis could not match Allied production, their first line of operational strength was maintained. The great air battle of Europe was still undecided. But by February of 1944, there was a distinct and dramatic change. The Allies were gaining air superiority. The P-51s were ordered to range wider, to seek the German fighters in the air and on the ground, instead of waiting for him to come up. A gigantic fighter battle raged across the European sky, with the Germans sustaining heavy losses. 60, 80, sometimes 100 Messerschmitts destroyed in one day. Fighter ace James Hill remembers seeing an opportunity too great to pass up.
I saw some airplanes come up from out of the undercast, climbing up toward the bombers, and I called them in to our flight leader, Colonel Beeson, and he said, "Yes, I see them, so just hang on." So they kept climbing up, and he maneuvered around until he got in a position to attack them prior to their being able to fire at the bombers. And we came up behind them, and he said, "I'll take the leader and you take the wingman." So we did, and came up, and he shot down his airplane and his enemy airplane, and I had maneuvered, checked all the switches and maneuvered up and got behind mine and had a perfect shot, and I pulled the trigger and nothing happened. So I drifted back a little and rechecked all the switches and making sure that everything was set right, pulled back up, and he had not moved. So I pulled the trigger again, and still nothing happened. And I did that one more time, and still no response, and by this time Colonel Beeson had peeled off and he was getting away, and I didn't want to get lost on that first mission, so I pulled off and left the airplane and joined back up with Colonel Beeson. He came back and shot that man down, and he shot down 3 on that particular flight. So we came back, and in those days, when you had a victory, you buzzed the field and pulled up and did a victory roll for however many airplanes you had shot down. So he did that, and I stayed up and didn't do anything but follow around. Came in, landed, and taxied up to the parking spot and called the crew chief over and was really mad at him, and I was angry, and so I started berating him quite strongly. And he said, "Now, just calm down, Lieutenant, and show me what you did." So I showed him, and I went through all the switches, and I said, "Now, this is the way things ought to be, and I've turned all the switches properly, and the guns won't fire," and I pulled the trigger, and nothing happened. And he said, "Well, that's your problem. You don't fire this airplane by pulling the trigger. You fire the guns on this airplane by pushing the bomb button." And I said, "Well, there's two things wrong. You didn't tell me that as a crew chief, and secondly, I wasn't briefed on that case in the briefing for the flight." And he said, "Well, I don't know anything about that." And so I said, "Well, why do you do this? That doesn't make any sense to me." And he said, "Well, the reason we do it is that you young guys go over there and you get all engaged in shooting down airplanes, and you have a lot of adrenaline, and you come back and you pull up and you do your victory rolls, and you come around on your landing and you're pulling back on the stick, and you haven't turned your switches off, and so you're pulling the trigger while you're pulling the stick back, and you're spraying bullets all over everywhere. And so in order to eliminate you guys shooting at us on the ground when you're coming back, we rewired the airplane so that you fire them by pushing the bomb button instead of pulling the trigger." Well, that was my first mission. I had an opportunity to shoot down at least one airplane on my very first mission, and it was, I could not have missed it, and I couldn't do it because I didn't know how to fire the gun.
The Me-109 was one of the premier fighter aircraft of World War II, but it was no match for the Mustang. And it could not match the sheer numbers of new Allied fighters and bombers coming across Europe. German warplanes of every kind and in fantastic numbers were splashed all over the landscape of northwestern Germany and occupied Holland, Belgium, France. This was a crucial battle. Both sides were aware of the events, with air domination itself at stake. Many of the Germans' aircraft exploded over their own forests and housetops or were driven into the ground. So many of their famous fighter aces met death at the hands of Allied pilots that it shattered the morale of the Nazi pilots. The Axis defense plan was smashed. The P-51 Mustang seized any opportunity to fight. Down they went to blast the German planes to pieces and burn them on their own airfields all over Western Europe and in the very heart of Germany.
We were on an armed reconnaissance mission at this time. The war was far enough along that the bombers didn't need any escort anymore, so we were flying armed reconnaissance, and we were flying around toward Berlin. We had been escorting, or been with some tanks. General Patton was moving forward with the tanks, and so we were out in front of them and on an armed reconnaissance. And it was clear weather. We were flying at about, must have been about 18,000 feet. And I was the leader of we had 12 airplanes, and I was the squadron leader at the time. So I saw some airplanes down very low, and I couldn't follow them very well because they were flying over a dense forest. They were, of course, dark color, and but I did see the airplanes. And then I finally determined that there was an airfield cut out of the trees in that forest area. So I said to the rest of the squadron, stay up here and I'll call you. I'm going to go down and reconnoiter this and see what's happening. So we got down there, and there were 109s in landing pattern. There were, I think, as I recall, there were 12 109s flying coming back into land in that little airfield that was in the middle of that forest. And so I called the rest of the squadron and said, come on down. These guys are here, and we're going to get them. So I caught the first one, and he had his wings, his flaps, and his gear down on the final approach, and I shot him down, and then the other guys came down by that time, and we shot down all 12 of those airplanes, the 109s, at their landing airfield. and of course that was a different kind of an experience because they were landing in an airfield which was in an unexpected place, and in a manner which they were hidden from high altitude to see. So you had to get down there to find them and to see them where they were. And when I got down there, I saw all these airplanes milling around in a traffic pattern, getting ready to land.
Returning from unchallenged escort duty and on many special missions, the Mustangs destroyed Nazi aircraft by the hundreds. Challenging enemy flak, sheets of machine gun fire from flak towers, and ground installations caused the Mustangs to suffer heavy losses, 4 times as many as they would have sustained in aerial combat. Earl Depner was shot down over the fields of France by an ME-109.
After the invasion, our group was assigned to the 19th Tactical Air Command, and we were supporting Patton's Third Army as they made their move through Europe. On this particular day, we were programmed to go make a dive bombing attack on several enemy airfields around Munich. We took off, and our flights, our squadrons, 3 squadrons, we had 12 airplanes per squadron. And the way the battle plan went, 2 squadrons were loaded with bombs and rockets, and they were going to do the ground attack phase of this mission. Our squadron was designated to provide top cover. We'd stay up above the others, and if any enemy aircraft attacked us, we were to fend them off and protect the aircraft who are going to do the ground work. So we formed up and headed off on our mission. This was from a base in France, near Saint-Dizier. I think it was called A64, was a number given to it. We crossed the Rhine River and passed near Karlsruhe and a few of those towns, and we got some flak about that time. Enemy ground forces firing at us, and we sort of weaved back and forth to evade the flak, and it finally stopped. So we started to gather up our formations again, and just getting in formation. And our friendly ground controller back behind our lines with his radar called us and said something like, "Heads up, many bandits your area." So at this time there was an overcast directly above us, just a thin overcast. And so we looked back, and all of a sudden it looked like it was raining Messerschmitts down out of this cloud. And so of course our squadron leader called the group leader and advised him that we were under attack back there, and we broke back into him. The group commander gave the order for them to jettison their bombs and turn back and engage the fighters. In the meantime, my wingman had been kind of separated on this jinking around, as the English called it, trying to evade the flak. And as we made our turn back around, I was in formation with my flight leader and his wingman. I could see off to one side that he was being shot up by a couple of Messerschmitts right in his tail. And I never saw him again after that. But we continued. All we could do at that point was just make a tight turn and try to evaluate the situation and see what we could do. We were under fire at the time, and as I was in a real tight, steep bank, and I could see tracers going by right in front of my nose. One of them hit my aircraft. There's the P-51 had what they call a header tank, like the top tank on your radiator. This is up just behind the propeller spinner. And of course it hit there, and all this coolant started blowing back over my windshield, over my canopy, and I couldn't see anything anymore. So I lost sight of my flight and anything else because my canopy was covered with coolant. Well, I knew that the engine wasn't going to run very much longer, apparently, with no coolant, so I made one more turn and trying to figure out, try to look back and see if I was being followed, and I wasn't. So I dove down out of the formation, got down close to the ground, and headed for home. I opened up the radiator coolant scoop. There was let more air through and cool down the engine as much as possible. And the engine ran long enough to get me back across the Rhine River and back into France.
Germany was besieged by a strategic bomber attack in World War II, both the British at night and the Americans by day. Increasingly, the Germans put larger and more powerful cannons in their aircraft, such as the Me-109. The Germans would have a 20-millimeter cannon firing through the propeller. They would have two 30-millimeter cannons under the wings. These armament combinations would be very effective if a fighter was going against slow-moving bombers and could close to effective firing range with all four different kinds of weapons sighted on that bomber. But they were totally ineffective in fighter versus fighter combat. They were ineffective because the individual firing rate of those weapons tended to be very slow. As a result, fighters could be exposed to a burst of fire from a German aircraft and could fly through the bullet pattern, or could evade the hits, or would take one hit out of 6 weapons fired at it at one time. In contrast, the concentrated packages of 6 50-caliber machine guns, or 8 50-caliber machine guns in the P-51, were a much more effective means of projecting power from the aircraft against an opponent. The Nazis simply failed to make the design changes needed to keep up with Allied aircraft. By 1943, the Allied strategic bombing campaign forced Germany, because of public opinion and the fears of its own senior military leadership, to devote more and more of its resources to addressing the strategic bomber threat. That meant German industry increasingly was forced to produce radars and anti-aircraft artillery to combat the bombers. It was forced to produce night fighters and heavy day fighters. Germany was no longer able to produce the kind of weapons it needed to win the war. To win a war, a country needs new fighters, bombers, submarines, tanks, and battlefield artillery. By 1943, Germany was forced to spend its resources defending itself. At the very same time, Allied production was building an offensively oriented juggernaut that would smash Nazi Germany in 1944 and 1945.
In addition to this notion that air war is a hugely complicated, complex, and very expensive undertaking, that it doesn't necessarily arrive at a quick solution, I think what's apparent from the Second World War is how essential air power nevertheless is in terms of victory in modern warfare. The U.S. Army Air Forces, in the context of Europe, the 8th and the 15th Air Force in particular, were a main component in German defeat. Not the only component, certainly, but a principal component in their defeat. If you add the efforts of the RAF Bomber Command, and of course some of the other tactical air forces, here you have, in the earliest years, the only way to attack Nazi Germany, when it would be years before any serious effort could be made on the ground to invade. This was the only way that Germany could be brought under direct attack, and that's worth noting. And then once that attack got underway in a systematic and sustained sort of way, with the resources that were necessary to take German cities on during the day in the case of the Americans, and routinely at night by the British with huge numbers of bombers, in some case raids over 1,000 airplanes, now the Germans are hurting enough where a terrific amount of Nazi resources have to be used to stop that or to mitigate the effects of that attack. At one point, the Germans are using almost 1 million people in the defense of Germany in terms of anti-aircraft defense alone. And on top of that, you think of German fighter resources, huge numbers of fighter planes, and not to mention the infrastructure, radar, and the other things to sustain that effort, to stop Allied air attack day and night. Those resources could easily have been, and better used from the German point of view, on the North African front, certainly on the Eastern front, any number of places. But no, they had to be over Germany to stop this attack. And that shouldn't be overlooked. And then finally, towards the end, when the target arrays actually became clear and the Allies systematically hit transportation and oil targets in Germany, what we found was that the German war machine ground to a halt. German oil production dropped almost 90% in the last 6 to 9 months of the war. This effectively brought to a stop the German military machine. And by transportation, I mean rail lines and rail centers and targets like that. Even when they were producing these things, as we now know they couldn't get them to the places that they needed to be. In other words, when you see pictures of thousands of German airplanes, or even the tank production rising, or they dispersed industry and they were still able to produce the implements of war, they didn't have the fuel to run them, and they didn't have the transportation to get them where it was needed. So we think of air war in these terms, that our undertaking of air war in Europe helped bring a decisive result by paving the way for the advance of the Allied armies and bringing the German military response to a standstill. The Germans weren't able to respond as effectively at Normandy and all the way across France and subsequently because their army was out of gas and their air force had disappeared from the skies. Well, they had plenty of airplanes hidden in the woods in southern Germany, but they couldn't fly at all. And that's what was so critical about the Allied air power contribution to World War II.
The Messerschmitt 109 was the envy of the aviation world at the start of World War II. But as Nazi Germany began to crumble, so too did the fate of this great warbird. No longer able to lead the German army into battle, the Me 109 paid the ultimate price in aviation history. It gave way to newer and better aircraft. But in its time and place, the Me 109 flew with eagles, one of the legendary warbirds of World War II. Chief designer for the Hawker Aircraft Company, met at the British Air Ministry with an official of the Research and Development Department. The Air Ministry had solicited designs for a new, faster fighter aircraft. Cam's design would accomplish this and much more, for what he brought with him were the blueprints for a revolutionary single-wing fighter, soon to be known as the Hawker Hurricane. Cam knew that the days of the biplane were at an end. A biplane with 2 wings and assorted struts and wires presented too much drag. Top speeds were limited to about 250 miles an hour. His new design finally put the biplane into the history books. While the Air Ministry was impressed with the plans presented by Cam, they were hamstrung by budget constraints and the post-World War I disarmament treaties. The need was there, but no planes were ordered. Meanwhile, in Germany, it was that same summer that Air Minister Göring met with and approved Willy Messerschmitt's plan for a new fighter aircraft for the Luftwaffe, called the Messerschmitt 109, the aircraft that became Germany's star fighter plane. Despite the British Air Ministry's reluctance to order a new fighter, the Hawker Aircraft Company went ahead with Cam's design on their own. They felt that eventually the Air Ministry would have to have a new fighter, and they were going to be ready. They were right. By February of 1935, the Air Council finally approved the new design. But in keeping with their conservative thought, only one prototype was ordered.
Great Britain had a great aviation tradition. The RAF had been independent since April of 1918. There were certainly different factions and different views of how best to employ British air power, but what it really had come down to was the development of a long-range strategic bomber force. People like Sir Hugh Trenchard and subsequently Bomber Harris spoke very passionately about the need for long-range aviation and an ability to bring enemy nations, in this case they were thinking much about Germany, under attack if Britain was ever threatened. Remember, Britain didn't have a big army and wasn't able to intervene with tremendous effectiveness on the continent in terms of land power, but long-range aviation was seen as a way to bring a potential enemy under attack or deter attack. There were a lot of people in Britain in the 1920s and 1930s that believed air power, long-range bombers and bombs used against cities, against civilians, would deter attack. This was a widespread notion in the 1920s and 1930s. The airplanes were terror weapons, frightened a lot of people. So what better way to protect yourself than to have this ability to inflict the same damage on an enemy? Britain also had a number of people who believed very strongly in fighter air defense and argued that Britain must be protected against similar kind of long-range attack from Germany or elsewhere. And as Britain had been attacked by Zeppelins in the First World War, London had come under attack from even German long-range bombers. To some extent, the British population demanded defense. So Britain had a little clearer sense of how aviation might be used, how air power might be used effectively in modern war, sort of giving equal status to bomber long-range aviation and fighter defense.
The Hurricane's frame, fuselage, and wings were built of tubular steel for strength. The frame was covered tightly with fabric, for this was before the widespread use of aluminum skin. The Hurricane II had a 40-foot wingspan, a length of 32 feet, and a height of 8 feet 9 inches. It had a maximum weight of 8,470 pounds and a maximum speed of 340 miles an hour at 21,000 feet. With a ceiling of 33,000 feet and a range of 460 miles, this single-engine, low-wing aircraft was the single most important fighter in the battle for Britain. Armaments included 12 Browning machine guns placed in the wings and the capacity to carry 2 500-pound bombs or 8 rocket projectiles.
Hurricane, quite famous, given credit, rightly so, for winning the Battle of Britain. Probably the Spitfire got more glamour and glory and press, but the real workhorse was the Hurricane. Once again, an airplane that had come out of the 1930s, modern for its time, heavily armed, not quite probably so maneuverable as other airplanes, able to withstand punishment, just a real workhorse. The British able to recognize when the airplane had sort of had its day and transferred it to other roles. It served in the desert and ground attack roles in other places. So an extraordinarily good airplane, justifiably famous for its role in the Battle of Britain, but one that when it became less useful and more outdated was superseded by other airplanes.
In October, the prototype was flown for the military's top command. The test pilot was Group Captain P.W.S. Bullman. Bullman rolled the Hurricane almost to the end of the runway before taking off and climbing straight up through the clouds. Bullman found that the plane, despite its much higher speed, was just about as maneuverable as the old biplanes. The Air Ministry was impressed and placed a substantial order for the plane. The tradition of those old planes set an example for the streamlined fighters and bombers of World War II. In that period of restriction, the Schneider Cup, a competition for the fastest plane in the world, was won 3 times in succession by the Royal Air Force. These planes, streaking at 340 miles an hour, indicated the enormous strides taken by aviation since World War I. The new models developed from the Schneider Cup seaplanes were just coming into production when World War II began. They were piloted by British citizens from around the empire. An especially large contingent of Canadian men joined the Royal Air Force with hopes of flying the new Hurricane. Young men from the prairies, from the mountains of British Columbia, from the Atlantic provinces. Raw rookies when they started, but soon they would be qualified pilots and observers flying the Hurricane. And while they drilled, the framework of a giant training plan took shape in Canada. Flying schools in the maritime provinces at Moncton, Summerside, Chatham. Training centers for observers, gunners, and the feel of the air without leaving the ground. In the rarefied atmosphere of 17,000 feet, he dons his oxygen mask and accustoms himself to a new mode of breathing. Finally, he gets his first taste of what it will be like to be alone in the clouds. In the Link Trainer, he learns the magic touch on the joystick, the touch that has made pilots say that flying is the only realm where individualism counts for everything, and where the spirit of youth is at the controls. But before a pilot was allowed to fly, he had to go through a long and exacting time on the ground. He had to master the mathematics needed for aerial navigation. He had to get to know the modern world of radio communication. He had to get accustomed to working under the actual conditions of warfare. Then, prospective pilots were put through a series of tests with a ground trainer that shows the pilot how to fly by instruments alone. In the blind Link Trainer, listening in his headphones to the instructor's directions, he acquires the personal skill that will one day enable him to fly 600 miles over a darkened Europe to Germany. In the same way, his instructor taught him to use the Lorentz beam, which would guide him to a safe landing in England when fog and blackout had hidden his home field. The interrupted note tells him that he'd come into the path of a beam to take up his true course. Carefully, he crossed the airfield, turned, and came down for a blind landing. It looked easy, but could be quite difficult. In this case, one instrument, the altimeter, escaped the eye. He forgot that he was losing height too fast. This pilot would have died a horrible death. Day by day, the plan grows in size and scope as ever more planes come into active service. But for every pilot in the air, there must be some 20 men on the ground for maintenance and overhaul. So at St. Thomas, Ontario, an army of 3,000 young mechanics gathered to master the intricacies of modern aircraft. Starting from the motors of the small trainers, they worked their way up to the giant Merlin engines of the Hurricane. But even to the most advanced trainee, this maze of struts and wires is sometimes just a Chinese puzzle. 9 weeks of intensive training on the Hurricane, and at last comes the day when the pilot makes his first flight alone. Day by day, the pilot learns to conquer the vast, uncharted spaces of the sky. Beneath his hand, the throttle of his roaring motor. Before his eyes, the flash of his propeller and the gleaming sunlight. Then comes a red letter day, when before the whole assembled station, the new pilot claims his wings. the coveted emblem signifying that he's no longer an apprentice, but a flyer. Now he is ready for action, ready to take his Hawker Hurricane into one of the greatest air battles in aviation history, the Battle of Britain. Early in the air war, the British rapidly took the measure of their opponents and adjusted their tactics accordingly. These adjustments would spell doom for the Germans during the Battle of Britain. The Messerschmitt 109 fighters that escorted German bombers were formidably fast, and whenever possible, the swift new Spitfires were sent up against them. The slower Hurricane was assigned to strike at the bombers. But with the Hurricane squadrons outnumbering the Spitfires nearly 2-to-1, the Hurricane pilots had no choice but to learn how to mix it up successfully with the Me-109. The lesson they learned was to never climb, never dive, just turn and turn again. It was found that the Hurricane could always turn tighter than its adversary. Thus, if an Me-109 was on the Hurricane's tail, the pilot could turn hard and the German plane would simply slide by. Eventually, with good piloting, this would put the Hurricane on the tail of the 109 for a flank shot. Often a Hurricane pilot would see a 109 in front of him, beginning a turn in an attempt to get behind the British plane. Because the Hurricane could turn inside the 109, the British pilot could simply turn tighter and wait for the 109 to come into his gun sights. The fighter squadrons of Hurricanes were called upon to battle faster and better armed enemy aircraft because there was no other option. The pilots knew the danger and knew what was at stake and flew like they had never flown before. With great skill, the pilots took off with their Hurricanes and swept into the air. Little did they realize what awaited them. Men from Britain and Canada, Australia and New Zealand, South Africa, India, and Rhodesia were represented in that momentous sky battle which helped to save England. It was the quality of the men and machines of the Royal Air Force that won that great battle. It was the same superiority of the Allies that won final victory. The following shots of Nazi convoys being attacked by Hurricanes were devastating proof of the might of the RAF in action. After the Battle of Britain was won, more attention could be focused on other fronts. One place where the Hurricane played an important role was as a tank buster in the deserts of North Africa.
When we first went over, the British and the Germans, and of course before the Germans, the Italians, they'd been running up and down the coastline of Africa for 2 or 3, 4 years. And when the Germans came in and took over finally, they had pushed the British 8th Army back to the El Alamein line. Now that was the summer of 1942. The line held, and they built up their forces, and then they mounted their offensive and started pushing the Germans back. And this continued all the way to Tunis, where the Germans were finally pushed in the sea or surrendered Africa.
Morning in the Western Desert in the last months of 1942. This squadron was a small unit in the great force that pursued Rommel across the wastes of Libya and was camped somewhere between El Alamein and Tripoli before the collapse of the Axis forces in North Africa. As the blazing day begins, ground crews strip off the camouflage canvas covers which hide the tank-busting Hurricanes. The squadron has been moving ahead for weeks now, a day or two here, and then on to a new place just like this, but nearer Tripoli. The ground crews were always busy when the aircraft were not flying. This morning, as usual, there is plenty of work to do on the Hurricanes, repairing and making last-minute adjustments. The Hurricanes started life as a fighter, but new developments allowed them to become observers, carrier-based aircraft, and even seaplanes. There were many modified fighter versions. Then came the Hurry bombers, and then the new and formidable type, the Hurricane 2D, the tank buster. It was armored with 2 40-millimeter cannons slung under the main planes. These, the largest 4 weapons yet fitted on any flying aircraft, weighed only 320 pounds. They fired 2.5-pound shells, and the aircraft also carried Browning machine guns, a devastating total of firepower. The Hurricane 2D was the answer to the German tank warfare of the desert. Quite a lot of time in war is spent waiting to go into action. This very moment, some tank busters are wanted in a hurry to go where the enemy has put some rear guard tanks to harass Allied forces. The pilots rush out to the machines. Engines burst into life. Chocks away. The Hurricanes move out of position and taxi out to the runway. They roar across the sand into the sky. Most of the tank busters' pilots are old desert campaigners. They first saw action in June 1942 after months of experimental work. In the first year of the El Alamein offensive, they destroyed many German tanks. Low over the desert they flew, low over the mechanized columns of advancing Allied army. Soon they had to climb to a great height to cross the dead ground between the Allies and the German army, led by the Desert Fox Rommel. Target below. Hurricanes peel off and swoop down to the attack. The German tank is blazing now, knocked out of the war by the tremendous firepower from the Hurricane's tank-buster cannons. The job has been well done, and so the flight reforms and heads for home to the little camp, which, no matter where it may be, is the center of the squadron's life.
We lived in the British tents. They were good tents. They sloped this way, and then had another cover on top of that, which that airspace would drop the temperature maybe 20 degrees. It was always 100 to 120 degrees in the desert. If we had what they call a dust storm, everything stays put. You don't dare go from one tent to another unless you can pick up a telephone wire and carry it in your hand, because you could go right by your tent you're headed for and go right out in the desert. You couldn't see 20 feet when it was that bad. So the only thing to do is just stay put wherever you are. We had bedrolls, which we sometimes bedrolls, now cots, which we placed the cots below the ground, dig in a little bit so we could be down a little bit. When we got ready to move, we divided the squadron and all the squadrons this way. Divide the squadrons into A party and the B party. A party would move up to the next base, and the B party would stay behind until the next base is open. Then we go in and land, or we may land on a return from a mission. And then when they got that open, then B party would take off and go for the next landing space. If the line wasn't moving fast enough, they would join up again with the A party until they were open for the next base. So we just leapfrog all the way across, and we could sometimes move maybe every 2 or 3 days, or it might be several weeks, you see, depending on how we're going. It was a very harsh situation. Had black scorpions out there. My squadron was called the Black Scorpion Squadron. And you don't put your boots on anymore unless you shake them out. I think we all kind of approached it with the idea we had a job to do, and everybody was on an upbeat. At night, for example, we'd sit around, and believe it or not, in those days, we fought to see who was going to play Monopoly. We had a Monopoly board. And we didn't have a lot of gambling, and we didn't have a lot of heavy drinkers. I mean, we just had a job to do, and everybody got along with it. They got along with the job, and I thought our morale was very high, always high. And we just, and of course, we seemed like we was blessed with success too, you know, since the British 8th Army was moving like they're supposed to be.
and the Halifax. The British built up a tremendous bomber force designed as offensive air weapons to smash at the heart of Germany. The United States built bombers that contributed greatly to the RAF. RAF pilots flew a variety of U.S. planes, especially the Lockheed Hudson. Add the Flying Fortress. There's also the question of manpower to fly them, so it was important that the high standard of British recruits and the efficiency of their training be maintained. Whenever an RAF plane was in the sky, it was the men aboard her which turned her from an amazingly efficient machine into the supreme tool of the Allied cause. The best aircraft in the world is a poor instrument without the skill and courage of the crew.
Crew integrity was very important because they knew each other and they'd started in training together, usually. There was some maneuvering, because occasionally you'd find a guy that didn't get along with another guy and you'd put him on another crew. But basically those 10 guys were bonded in a unique way, because when you're fighting a war, that relationship changes. It's not like any other kind of a relationship. When you're in the nose of my airplane, I'm the top turret gunner, and you do your job and I do my job and we both get home. It was extremely difficult. West Point class graduated in June of '41, and over 100, we graduated 424 people, over 100 of them went into started pilot training, and probably 100 or a little less got through, because there was attrition. You wash out a guy that can't do it. But out of that 100, we lost 34 during War II. That's very high attrition.
(1942), the offensive mounted. In May, 1,000 bomber raids in the Ruhr and Rhineland, experiments in saturation bombing, which were to point the way to the great night battles of 1943. In August, an amphibious assault met disaster at Dieppe, but British fighters, led by the Hurricane, held the enemy back from the ground forces on the beaches and the Allied shipping offshore. Throughout 1943 and the early months of 1944, the air war grew and grew. By day, German aircraft factories were pounded, and defending fighters were shot down in large numbers. By night, their heavy industries were blasted and burned. The Germans were forced to withdraw more of its guns, its airplanes, and its manpower from possible invasion areas to defend the Reich. By the autumn of 1943, the air situation was such that detailed plannings of an invasion of France could begin. The Hurricane's war against the Luftwaffe continued, with the new phase of the air plan now open, air power applied in direct relation to the landing sites planned for D-Day. A new command was formed, the Allied Expeditionary Air Force, with British Air Chief Mallory in command, with the American Major General W.G. Butler as his deputy. The force consisted of the British 2nd Tactical Air Force of fighters, fighter bombers, and light bombers under Air Marshal Sir Arthur Cunningham, and the 9th American Air Force of medium bombers and fighters. There were also reconnaissance wings, a group of defensive fighters, a transport group, and a group for airborne operations. To understand the work which these air forces had before them in the months before D-Day, you must understand the outline of the overall military strategy. The intention was to make landings along the strip of coast between the mouth of the Arn River and the base of the Cherbourg Peninsula, to cut off the peninsula and secure Cherbourg as a supply base. But the very reasons for choosing this plan made it all the more difficult to carry out. The Germans didn't believe they would choose this area. It's hard to supply and a long way from the Allied objective, Germany. The Nazis thought they would land along the coast higher up, rich in ports with a shorter channel crossing and much nearer Berlin. The Allies relied on air supremacy and their known ability for amphibious operations to confound the German calculations. But to land a fully trained and equipped force is one thing. To maintain a bridgehead and pour in supplies and reinforcements is another. Victory in the opening battles would go to the side which could concentrate the greatest force in the shortest time. For this purpose, the Germans had at their disposal the elaborate road and railway systems of northern France and the canals and rivers. The Allies would have to cross 100 miles of treacherous channel in boats small enough to run up on the flat beaches of Normandy. The project appeared impossible. To accomplish the impossible, it was imperative that the Allied Air Force be able to reverse the balance by paralyzing German communication and transportation, and they had to isolate the invasion target area of France. Hurricane squadrons piloted by Canadians were given the task to search for and destroy enemy trains. The Hurricane's 8 guns and ability to carry bombs made it especially suitable to this task. Despite the Hurricane's accomplishment of knocking out many trains, the Allies had learned that railway lines and roads could quickly be repaired, so they had to concentrate a great deal on bombing the most vulnerable points: munitions yards, railroad junctions, workshops, bridges, and supply depots. Again, these must be destroyed without giving the enemy any idea of where the Allies might land, and they had to do their utmost to avoid damage and casualties to the friendly civilian population. By D-Day, Out of 80 selected railway centers, 51 were out of action, and 25 more were badly disorganized, 76 out of 80. Thanks in large part to the Hawker Hurricane, among other Allied fighters, in the 9 weeks before D-Day, 2,655 German planes were destroyed in combat. The Allies were passing from air superiority to air supremacy. During the early landings, the air forces were destined to play a protective role. Bombers laid smoke screens. Hawker Hurricanes swarmed over the beaches and shipping lanes. The air preparation had been so thorough, German air interference was insignificant. Hurricanes, armed with cannons and rockets, gave German troops who were rushing up to the battle a burst of explosive fury. During the landing operations and the many weeks before and after, Coastal Command kept watch on the Dutch and transatlantic ports for U-boats and surface craft, which were expected to break into the channel to disrupt Allied shipping lanes. Small convoys slipping down the coast would be spotted by the Coastal Command and rocketed and torpedoed by coast-based fighters. When D-Day came, the German Navy was forced to stay at home. As the Allies had planned and hoped, the German command was deceived up to the point of landing. When they discovered their mistake, they were unable to rush reserves into the area in time to stop the Allies from making a firm beachhead. Though shells and trucks and tanks and even German agents were continually breaking their lines, the system never broke down. Neither did the Hawker Hurricane. The Hurricane went through many changes during the war. Designers were always trying to make it fly faster, carry more weapons, climb higher. But the basic aircraft did not change, nor did the powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The versatility of the Hurricane was unmatched by any other aircraft in World War II. Whatever the fighter was called upon to do, it did it, and did it well. It was, without question, one of the finest warbirds of World War II.